Tonight we have Rand Nisbett, who will be speaking about Aldo Leopold, as we're all aware. Rand is a great friend. He was part of our CCC program, a few years ago. I can't remember. It was wonderful having Randy spend the year with Rand. And he has a wonderful background of, he's an ecologist, public health, forest conservationist, working for 30 years with indigenous peoples all across the globe, now living down in the Mobile area, and is working with trying to restore a forest down there, water quality monitoring. He's a man of many hats, broad interests. I'm so looking forward to what he has to share with us tonight. And then we have the treat of John Gatta, who will be conversing with Rand after Rand gives his presentation. And John is a professor emeritus of English from the University of Connecticut, as well as here in Sewanee, and is very knowledgeable about environmental literature, perhaps especially American environmental literature, and loves Leopold. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and then we'll have question and answer. And if while they're talking, if some question starts to emerge in your mind, please go ahead and put that in the chat. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll then be able to bring your questions to both John and Rand. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Rand, and looking forward to your talk.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Robin. It's really a special treat for me. Aldo Leopold has had a tremendous influence on my career and life, and I hope I can meet Jane's expectations for talking about him. He's a very complex, remarkable man. I was thinking, I've been studying him pretty intensively for the last 6 months or so. And I was thinking it would take a semester-long course to really cover his contributions and so many different aspects of conservation and ecology that he is considered the founder of. It's just a remarkable story. So I'll try to go through that fairly rapidly, because my original idea when I approached Robin about this was that I was hoping we could have a conversation. There are a lot of good videos out there. There's a lot of information that the Aldo Leopold Foundation has on their website. This is the 75th anniversary of the publication of Sand County Almanac, which was his book that was written for the lay audience. And it's a remarkable book. It's been translated into several dozen languages and several million copies sold around the world. So he's had a huge influence on the global conservation movement, and the things that we're doing today in conservation and biodiversity derive directly from what he was talking about, and unfortunately we didn't listen very closely a century ago. At any rate, let me thank everyone at Deep Green Faith for their many contributions. If you haven't checked into their website, there's a lot of great stuff there, a lot of great programming, a lot of videos and things that you can use as resources in your groups. And I appreciate everything they've done to really make this happen. I have to do a special shout out to my cohort from living in an icon. I see Sister Elizabeth and Deacon Joy, and I appreciate their presence here. And also my dear friends from the Gulf Coast Creation Care Group. Our president, Rhoda, is here tonight, as well as Justice Manning. So I appreciate their attendance. And I want to do a special welcome to Pat Watkins. Pat is one of the outstanding leaders in United Methodist Church Creation Care Circles for many years, decades perhaps. Very active in United Methodist Creation Justice. Was on a pilgrimage fairly recently to the island of Iona. So I really appreciate you being here, Pat, and for this synergy perhaps that can come between United Methodist Creation Justice and Deep Green Faith as we move forward into the future. So let me see, am I supposed to hit share screen? Do I do that?
Yeah, you would do that. You have that option, yes.
Okay, and so let me see if I can pull this up. Can you see this?
Not yet, but hold on.
Okay,
Not seeing any reaction though.
okay, let me go back and see what I did wrong. There's what I did wrong.
It's good to find. Yeah,
Yeah,
there we go.
see that. Yet?
Yep, passing the piece.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let me, oh, see, this thing always does this.
We're seeing, yeah, we're seeing your working. We're not seeing your. There we are. We're
yeah,
not seeing it
I
either.
can't,
You
yeah,
need to see the show. There we are.
yeah, my scroll bar is covering my options to actually do the show. So
That should do it though.
that should do
And
it.
it does. Very good.
All right, well, thank you. I've still got that scroll bar at the top. That's weird.
Well, it's looking good though. I mean,
Anyway.
we have nothing but the show going right now.
Okay, good. So this is a photo from the Aldo Leopold Foundation website, and the sandhill cranes are migratory up there, but they're a huge part of their programming. And you see this beautiful quote at the very bottom from Aldo Leopold that a sandhill crane is ineffable beauty, beyond the reach of words. Kind of reminds me of Robin's essay, Beauty by Design, if for those of you who have read that. But I wanted to start with this slide just to say that I want to hold in the light all of those humans and those other creatures that are in the path of the hurricane tonight. It's really a powerful storm and quite dangerous. And so I hope that we can hold them in our hearts as we go through this, because it should be, as we're going through this presentation, they should be really getting the brunt of this, at least in Appalachia Bay in coastal Florida. So let's see what we can do. Okay. I'm sorry, my screen is really kind of strange here, so this is kind of interesting. Well, we're going to talk about Aldo Leopold's land ethic primarily. He wrote a lot of things, you guys, and it's hard to kind of concentrate on one or two of those as really being similar. And I think at the end you'll have Professor Gata coming back in and talking about some really important writing of his. But his land ethic was proposed over a various number of years in a lot of different publications. We find it most accessible in his book, the Sand County Almanac, but it really was developed over a longer period of time, and it's been criticized that it's a little bit too general. People wanted him to give us the 10 commandments of the land ethic, and he didn't do that. And I think he was very wise in not doing that. So what I want to talk about is give you an introduction or some exposure to him, and a little bit of what his life was about, and how he came to some of these insights on the natural world. And then maybe take it a little bit more global with regard to creation care and the global and environmental citizenship. He talked a lot about environmental citizenship and how do we as humans play our role in what he called the land ethic, of course. So we'll talk about a few of those themes as well. So what I want to do is just talk about who was Aldo Leopold, for those that maybe are less familiar. What is the land ethic? And what might global environmental citizenship look like from our perspective in creation care? So who is this man? Well, he's a really fascinating guy that gave us so many of the insights and so many of the agencies that we think about when we consider the forest and the national parks and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife today. He was really at the beginning of all of those. One of the remarkable things about him is that nearly every biographer has said, hey, he was a family man, and he was. He wrote his wife nearly every day, and if you look at the travels that he undertook under very difficult circumstances, that's remarkable to me. I've decided that really he's the only person I can imagine who must have had a 30 or 36-hour day, because he read voraciously. He was a prolific writer. I cannot imagine when I read the biographies and read a lot of his work, I feel like I've just wasted the life God gave me. This guy was really busy and there was a lot of pushback. It's not like everything went his way. He he really got a lot of criticism from every sector when he would propose a lot of his ideas with regard to how we should be in relation with the natural world. So here he is with his dog sitting out at his shack writing there in that photo in Wisconsin. So just very briefly, this is his time span, 1887 to 1948. He was born in Iowa and died in 1948 of a heart attack, putting out a grass fire on his neighbor's property in Wisconsin. But he was primarily a forester. He went to Yale School of Forestry. One of the first classes, I believe at that time, the way I understand it from the literature, is that there was really only Michigan, Harvard, and Yale had schools of forestry at that time. So it was a really a good program with a lot of the people who were going to be the future leaders in forest conservation, forest management, coming through the program at that time. Once he left Yale, he got an assignment as a very young man as the forester for Apache National Forest in New Mexico. And then after that, Carson National Forest, an area that I grew up in New Mexico. And that's where he really cut his teeth on trying to understand the environment and the animals and how they were interacting and what our responsibility was. Remember that early on, the national forests were created by Teddy Roosevelt, but they weren't parks or anything like we think about them today. They were resources that were to be used to create revenue. So you would have stockmen and ranchers who would lease out this land in the forest in order to raise their cattle, and that would generate revenue, for instance, for the war effort for World War I. So it was a very different sort of system than we imagine today, and he saw it on a much grander scale. He saw it as an area of recreation, of refuge, of reconnection with the natural world. He saw it very differently than the federal government did at that time. So he spent, you see, a lot of years there as a forester. He left that and became a director of operations for the Forest Products Laboratory at the University of Wisconsin in 1924. He was miserable there. He did not like the job. He didn't like what he was doing. He didn't want to look at forest products, so those byproducts of timbering or something that can be useful economically. That was really not what he was. He was a field guy, and he wanted to be out there in the field with animals, and that was really really unenjoyable period of his life. Then he became a private sector consultant, and he went around several states creating game surveys. Here's a game survey from Mississippi that he did in 1928, 100 pages long, very detailed, and he went around to 10 or 12 states and did these and wrote them up and published them. Looking at game surveys of what's going on with the forest, what's going on with the animals, what's going on with farming. So that's what he was doing during that private sector consultancy during those 4 years there. Then he became a professor of wildlife management at the University of Wisconsin. He was the first appointment ever in game management and wildlife management. It was a brand new field. And he encountered a lot of pushback from the university and everybody else because, well, that's not a valid discipline. That's not what education is. What are you doing out here studying game populations and whatever? So being at the beginning of a new field like that was really created a lot of challenges for him. He's got 2 books that are considered seminal. Game Management is a professional book about, obviously, game management in 1933, and Sand County Almanac, which is his lay audience sort of book from 1949. It was published posthumously. It had been rejected by Oxford University Press every time he had submitted it, but then after he died, they accepted it and has become pretty much a classic in the field of conservation studies. This man wrote several hundred articles, technical reports, policy statements, essays, speeches, letters. It's a phenomenal record, all archived at the University of Wisconsin. It's mind-boggling to get into his archives and try to understand all these different facets of his personality. Today, at the very minimum, we would say that he is the founder of the conservation ethic, soil and water conservation, game protection, wildlife ecology, wildlife management, forest management. And he gave us the concept of a wilderness reserve. And he created the first two that we had in the United States, Gila Wilderness in New Mexico and Superior National Forest, which is the boundary canoe waters up there on the border of Canada and the US. So he's just made seminal contributions to the whole field of forestry especially, but also how do you manage the game and the wildlife there. And of course, his spiritual aspect was then how do you connect with them? And that's really what the land ethic is about. Okay, so a couple of slides here. As a former academic, I have to talk a little bit about ecological science. So this was a very new field at the time, and he was in on the very beginning of this. And the definition that we would use today is it's the scientific study of these interactions among members of a biotic community and their abiotic environment, right? But that was not a given at the time that he was really working. These were just coming to the fore with regard to coalescing around this field that we today recognize as ecology. And we all know a lot of ecology, whether we know that we know it or not. So I have the biomes in here because the interesting thing about Aldo Leopold is that he had great time depth. He understood all these processes working through deep time, and he understood how they affected one another. How can a freshwater habitat affect a whole ecosystem? And how do ecosystems interact with one another? So he was seeing the geographic breadth of these systems as well as the deep time involved. And it's what allowed him to really see patterns that I think that even today we don't really understand, perhaps as well as he did, because he was out there living this, you know. So again, academic ecology is really fairly new. It really only became of age with the Flower Children really in the 1960s. But starting from 1905, from Frederick Clements there down, all of these are contributions from American ecologists. Most of them are books. So I'm trying to situate him within this movement that created a new academic discipline. And he had his book there, which is still considered a classic in game management, but he also has had two very important journal articles, Conservation Ethic and Conservation Economics. Those were in the Journal of Forestry. You can actually access those online, especially if you have an academic friend who can get them for free. But the main contribution that he was making during this emergence of this academic discipline of ecology was that ecology was a field of ethics. It wasn't part of biology or zoology, and that was part of the misunderstanding and what he was really working against. He considered ecology ethics. And anybody who has a biology or zoology degree here or has done a whole lot in those fields realizes, yes, we've come a long way. I mean, every university has an IACUC, which is an institutional animal care and use committee. So they determine how we behave and how we interact ethically with animals, whether it's in the lab or in the field. But the point is, those are not really ethical fields, are they? I mean, they're not situated within the field of ethics. Whereas ecology, the way he conceived it, really was. And you see that when you look at his land ethic. Other people there made tremendous contributions, a great many of them at the University of Wisconsin during this just seminal time period for the development of ecology in the US. So here are some of the things that I want to mention very briefly. That this comes from Kurt Main's biography, a 600-page biography of Aldo Leopold. It's just a massive magisterial book, amazing. I don't understand how he did everything that he did, or how Carl Main actually wrote that biography. But these are the fields that we see out there today that have been influenced by Aldo Leopold. And you can read the list for yourself there: dynamic ecology, phenology, soil and water conservation, the critique and the concept of the wilderness myth, land scale approaches, private land. He was really, really invested in what today we would call public-private partnerships. He wanted to work with landowners. He saw that as where the revolution was going to occur, is this transformation of individuals and their relationship to the land. which is very different. He was very anti-government, even though he was sucked into the New Deal. He was sucked into FDR, who appointed him to several commissions. He served very admirably, but he really did like politics. He really did not like government bureaucracies. And he really felt like this is something that individuals had to do. They had to reorient their orientation, their relationships to the natural world. Well, anyway, food, agriculture, ecological restoration is a big topic today. All of that comes from him. He and his family restored several hundred acres of land in Wisconsin, planted over 1,000 pine trees. He created the Arboretum and Wildlife Refuge at the University of Wisconsin, which was 500 or 1,000 acres, doing ecological restoration, trying to rebuild the health of the soil and do those other sorts of activities that we recognize today. And he was into environmental justice and sustainability. He's had a huge influence on the greening of religion and philosophy in the academic world. So I've got those two underlined there: biodiversity and conservation biology and community-based conservation. He was really the founder of those areas. When I was getting my doctorate, I had to cobble together different papers, term papers, whatever, to address those topics. Only 30 years ago, that was not really a field of study, and yet he was way out in advance of that. My last student, I'm proud and pleased to say that I will support through their graduate studies, is a young West African who just finished his Master of Science in Biodiversity and Conservation Biology. Little university, poor little university in West Africa called Njala University. And yet look at that. Today you can have 10 or 15 courses and get a master's in Biodiversity and Conservation Biology in West Africa. And his thesis, I'm very proud of, was on alternative livelihoods for local people. So it was community-based conversation that Leopold was talking about in the 1930s. And we've got to do this at the individual and community level. We don't need the government doing this. They're just going to screw it up, was his viewpoint. So anyway, he's had a tremendous influence of all these areas of specialty that we're dealing with today that are very topical. Okay, so what is the land ethic? There's a very, very busy slide that I don't have time to go through. You can either look at this when you get the video and pause it, or I will send you a copy of this presentation if you email me. But basically what he was saying with the land ethic is that humans are part of the natural world. We have to start acting like it. We have to accept limits on our freedom that impact ventures that are not cooperative between others and the environment. And we have to accept that the right of nature must exist in and of itself. That's very topical today. I've been very involved in two movements, the Stop Ecocide movement, which is going to happen, and the Legal Rights for Nature movement. I see them directly as related to his values and his ethics with regard to valuing nature for what it is. It has the right to exist, and we need to behave in a manner that respects that. We'll come back to that later. So the rest of this is he did sort of set up a moral code. He didn't give the people the 10 commandments of the land ethic that everybody really wanted, but I think the genius was that he kept it very general and very broad, and let people decide for themselves what this really would mean in their relationship with the soil, with the land, with the animals on it. So here is just a little from his own words rather than me talking about it. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include the soils, water, plants, and animals, collectively, the land. We can be ethical only in relation to something we can see, feel, understand, love. Land then is not merely soil, it is a fountain of energy flowing through a circuit of soil, plants, animals. One of the requisites of an ecological comprehension of land is the understanding of ecology. I think that's important for all of us to realize that our knowledge base that really centers us in our work comes back to understanding ecological relationships. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. I have purposely presented the land ethic as a product of social evolution because nothing as important as an ethic is ever written. Only the most superficial student of history will suppose that Moses wrote the Decalogue. It evolved in the minds of a thinking community. Whether you agree with that statement or not, I love the fact that he talks about a thinking community because that really is what we want to be in our relationship with the natural world. So I only have to mention one thing here as an anthropologist. When you read Aldo Leopold, he contextualizes his land ethic from the perspective that it's never been discussed before. And I've lived and worked around the world, and everybody I know in indigenous communities understand that humans are part of nature, and they conceptualize their world that way. So I don't know how he really kind of missed this, given where he was and what interactions he had, which were incredibly diverse and broad. I've got a little photo of me in the corner because I spent 30 years, as many of you know, working in West Africa, trying to create and preserve and protect a national forest there that's one of the most valuable in the world, and it's 505 square miles, 323,000 acres of pristine lowland rainforest. And when I was working there, I had a young man who was actually on the board of trustees of his Methodist church, and he was working as my field assistant. And he was a member of the Sapo ethnic group, and his clan was the Weja clan, which is their word for chimpanzee. So he said that the chimpanzees were their big brothers, and they taught his people how to survive in the forest. Well, I don't know about that, but they were fun stories. One day I asked Thomas, I said, so what's the difference between chimpanzees and humans? And he rubbed his chin and he thought about that a little bit. And finally he said, chimpanzees don't wear trousers, which is really kind of interesting. It's kind of funny, but it's kind of interesting because material culture today, we would say, is the only salient difference between our species, the possession of material culture. So anyway, I went back and I looked at the years that these seminal programs in anthropology were formed. And it's true, when he was at Yale University, they didn't have an anthropology department. So he would not have been engaged in this conversation about humans as part of the natural world, the theology and cosmology of Native Americans that was just pervaded the anthropological world, and then went out into all the other social sciences. It had a tremendous impact on higher education in the US as it relates to things like cultural relativity and all of these things. But they went throughout many other disciplines within the social sciences. By the time he got to Wisconsin, their department, which was a very powerful department in anthropology, was formed in 1929. So surely he would have had colleagues there. He would have engaged in these conversations. But at any rate, when you read the land ethic as an anthropologist, go, okay, well, a lot of people have been saying that for 150 years and understand why this is new. But it was new to him, and it's important, so it really doesn't matter, does it? So I want to go a little bit then into ethos. Ethos is a really interesting word. It's archaic. We don't use it very much anymore. From Cambridge Dictionary, it talks about a set of beliefs, ideas about the social behavior and relationships of a person or group. In anthropology, we used it slightly differently. It was an attempt to capture the emotional communality or the ambience that a group shares, as opposed to their cognitive communality. So it's very inclusive. It entails the community membership, but also shared values and norms, but more importantly, what emerges from those norms? How do you behave? How do you act if you are a member of a community? So maybe something that, as an analogy, might make a little bit of sense here is if you look at the sacrament of the Eucharist. I've gone to a lot of churches. Many of them didn't know whether I was a believer or not, but they allowed me to sit through the sacrament. But it's really a very common experience, especially in most major denominations, right? I mean, we really, the liturgy is amazing, and it's really quite similar no matter what church you're in. The ritual, the order of activities, the order of things. But if you think about that, that's a cognitive communality. We understand the words and the shared values and what it means. But what if you took a group that believed in transubstantiation and one that didn't? Then a whole different sort of ambience and of meaning and power and perspective comes into that. It's really very, very different. And so in anthropology, that's how we would have used the word ethos. But it's very inclusive, and it's more than just shared values. It's about how you actually act out those values as lived faith. Okay, so what does a global environmental citizenship look like from our perspective in creation care? I have to mention E.O. Wilson here because he's from Mobile, Alabama. He just recently died in his 90s, late 90s, and also was at Harvard, one of the most famous biologists of our times, who gave us many wonderful concepts like consilience and biophilia, great books. But he said that humanity is exalted not because we are so far above the other living creatures, but because knowing them well elevates the concept of life. And a lot of his books go towards that theme. Here from Richard Rohr, to be a person of faith means that you see things, people, I'm sorry, I can't. Plants, people, oops, didn't want to do that. Plants, people, animals, the earth is inherently connected to God, connected to one another, worthy of love and dignity. That is what Jesus was praying for, that you would see things in their unity, in their connectedness. I would go so far to say that the more you can connect, the more of a saint you are, and the less you can connect, the less transformed you are. An interesting quote from Richard Rohr. I'm sorry, I have to I have to get rid of our photo montage here because it's in the way and I can't see my slides. So there's a lot of different schema out there for looking at spiritual development. But two of the prominent ones that most of you are probably familiar with are James Fowler's and Scott Peck's. Now they kind of take this through the stages of faith or spiritual development based on like the psychological or psychiatric development of children in a way, but they apply it to a faith perspective. So you see a lot of language there that's kind of like psychology to me. But James Fowler talks about stage one as being kind of a preschool level of fantasy and reality mixed. If you go back to that quote that I just gave you from Richard Rohr, the part of it that I did not include there is that he said we need to realize that most Christians are at the level of kindergartners with regard to their spiritual development. I didn't say that, he did. But the point is, they take you through these stages, and Scott Peck kind of combines a couple of those and comes up with 4 stages as opposed to 6 stages that Fowler had. But that final stage really is universalizing faith, and Peck calls it mystical communal. So if we just look at that kind of final stage or two, it's an ethos stage. Fowler says that stage 5 is reached at midlife, where one accepts paradox and the limits of logic, sees life as a mystery, returns to sacred stories and symbols. Stage 6 is rare. These are people who live their lives totally in the service of others. And for Peck, stage 4 is pretty much the same as Fowler, but he really emphasizes community. And Brian McLaren also has a really cool kind of schema on this, and his ultimate stage is harmony. But all of those words, I think, resonate with what we're talking about in getting into right relations with our communities of humans, but our ecological communities as well. And I think that this is what Aldo Leopold really was talking about. He was a very spiritual man, to me, is the way I read his work. So he tried to deal with this concept of environmental citizenship. How do we be good citizens? And basically, it goes back to the land ethic that we just consider ourselves part of nature. We try to understand that other aspects of nature, other plants, animals have rights. They have the right to be, to exist as they are, as part of the creation. One of his famous quotes is a conservationist, and he's talking about citizenship here, is one who is humbly aware that with each stroke he is writing his signature on the face of the land. So if we're thinking community of global environmental citizens, what does creation care start to look like in the context of this examination of Aldo Leopold? Well, first, it means being in solidarity with the victims of environmental injustice, doesn't it? And a lot of people, when they say creation care, that's what they're talking about. When I deal with young people in the UK and in our Iona group, a lot of things that we talk about are not really very important to them. Social justice, environmental justice is where they're at. And the other aspects of spiritual formation or actually caring for creation, not so big in their conversations. You know, it's all about justice, social justice. Secondly, then caring for creation. There's a lot of people who are involved in creation care that really believe that we have a mandate to help the earth heal through these activities of rewilding or restoration or reparation, whatever. So there's a segment of people that are very involved in doing those as a spiritual act. Supporting efforts to codify ecocide as a crime against humanity and the legal rights of nature. This is really getting great traction now. I've been involved in several of these groups, and it's going to happen now. The countries that have led on codifying these concepts have been the South American countries. They're in their they've enshrined them in their constitutions and their statutory law. The European Parliament now has taken up ecocide as a crime against humanity. The Pope Francis has signed on to that effort. The World Council of Churches have signed on to that effort. And if you're interested, I have a great little book that's been put together by a group called Faith Leaders to End Ecocide. People from around the world, from a variety of faith traditions, have written essays on why they feel this is really important. But ecocide is presently, of course, not a crime against humanity, and it probably really needs to be if we're going to show the respect that we need to creation with its right to exist. Legal rights of nature, ecosystems, habitats, species, populations. That movement is really moving forward now. The only instance I've seen in the United States is the state of Florida. There was a legislative bill to give the Apalachicola legal rights. So it has the right to free flow. It cannot be impeded. You have to protect it from a variety of acts of degradation or desecration. I think it died in committee, but the point is that's the first evidence I saw in the U.S. really of what this movement is. But it's a global movement that's got a lot of traction for legal rights of features, particularly rivers, but other features of an ecosystem, as well as particular species or animals. So growing spiritually in formation and renewal, seeking personal and societal transformation. I think we all are pretty much signed on to that. We went through contemplation and creation care with the Living in the Icon program. So we think a lot about spiritual formation and spiritual growth. But these are just other areas beyond that if you're thinking broadly about being a global environmental citizen, that we can find alliances. So living out an inclusive, expansive kingdom of God. And that to me means working across a variety of sectoral boundaries, in our societies. To me, it means working with non-believers. It doesn't matter. We're all in this together, and we really have to empower and work alongside one another. What about a strategic advocacy regarding the social cost of climate change and biodiversity loss? Most of us are advocates for that. Is it an ethical thing? Is it part of our faith or not? In the Iona community, it is. We have, as a member, we have to have financial accountability to the entire group. We also have to have carbon accounting accountability to the entire group. So you have to do a carbon accounting each year and show that you're reducing your emissions, you're reducing your footprint, you're reducing your consumption patterns that are dangerous. Should we be doing something like that as in broad Christian communities? I don't know, and I don't have an answer to that. But the social cost of carbon is really huge, and it's basically impacting people that have done the least to contribute to it, right? And we know that. We know there are millions suffering and dying today globally that didn't have anything to do with what they're dealing with. Do we need to talk about that, or do we only stay within our bubbles and not have to talk about it beyond our own faith groups? And then might we develop programs tailored to the faith adherence stage of spiritual growth? I've worked on creation care for 2 decades and with limited success, I feel, because I think that the communications have to be more strategic about where someone is in their faith journey. I think all of us, or at least everybody I know that has gone through living in an icon, contemplation and creation care, I think they were pretty much at a communal, mystical, universalist stage to begin with. And so we're speaking to the choir here, or we're preaching to the choir with regard to people who have arrived at this point where they want to be in clear ethical relationship with other creatures and with the whole of creation. But do we need to tether our messages differently? I don't know. So I'm getting very close to conclusion here. I just want to mention Jane Goodall, who is one of somebody who had a huge impact on my life, and the one or two most spiritual people in whose presence I've been in my life. And she says, any little thing that brings us back into communion with the natural world and the spiritual power that permeates all life will help to move us a little further along the path of moral and spiritual evolution. Now, I do know that she was churched as a young person. I don't know what her current affiliations are. And then Fritjof Capra, who is, of course, a very famous writer. He's written several really interesting books, The Tao of Physics and The Web of Life. And he says that at the deepest level, I'm sorry, I've got all these things on my screen and they're covering this up. At the deepest level of awareness, you were talking about spiritual awareness. Spiritual awareness is an understanding of being embedded in the larger whole of the cosmic whole of belonging to the universe. And I think that those are fellow travelers. These are people that believe and feel the same way as we do, and they may have arrived at it from a different route, but we need to be in alliance and allyship with all those people who feel that this is a spiritual pilgrimage that we're really on here. So let me really sum up very quickly. I would say that no facet of what we talk about in the whole of creation is untouched by his ideas if you really dig deeply into them. I agree with him that ecology must inform us and center our understanding of our relationship with other creatures, with other aspects of nature. Everything that we think about today with regard to our National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the wilderness refuges, the wildlife management areas, all of this comes from his writings and his empirical studies. It's remarkable. It's really stunning, the breadth that he was, the scope of his work at a time 1 century ago when it was really more difficult to do a lot of this work. So I would just conclude that we need him, and that conservation needs creation care, and that this ethos that we all are involved in, those people who are on this spiritual pilgrimage, we need to realize that we're on it together, and we need to build those alliances. So here's a little trail map. In Wilderness is the Salvation of the World. That's from Aldo Leopold. Those of you who love Henry David Thoreau will remember that he said, in wilderness is the preservation of the world. I like that quote a whole lot. I love Henry David Thoreau. I like this one better, to be real honest. John Muir, who was one of the founders of conservation in this country and is responsible for Yosemite, of course, and spent time in Madison, Wisconsin as well, said the clearest way to the universe is the forest wilderness. And then George MacLeod, the founder of the Iona community, said, go beyond what you think God is, because all roads lead home. So I've just got one little benediction here, if I might give it for you. Loving landlord, you loved us into being and willed us into a thinking community. Lead us back into the wilderness so that we can get our hands dirty, our feet wet, our souls rewilded, that we might be frisons of healing and wholeness. So that's it. Oh, one final quote. He loved trees. His whole family loved trees. And he said, but above all, I am in love with pines. So the theme of this tonight has been the pine trees, and in honor of Aldo Leopold and his family planting thousands of pine trees across Wisconsin to try to restore that environment and restore the vitality and the nutrients in the soil. Okay.
Hey, if you can unshare there. Let's see here. There we go. Well, thank you so much, Rand. That was wonderful. And John, would you be ready here to give us some of your thoughts on Rand's talk and add your own?
Sure. I think, one thing we certainly learned afresh from your talk, Rand, was how seminal a figure Aldo Leopold was, and in so many different spheres of life and learning, in things ranging from, you say, ecological science, game management, biodiversity. The philosophers too, and in our time, have focused on the land ethic as well. But the point I would make, not surprisingly, given my background, is that the reason why Leopold is not only a seminal figure in these particular disciplines, but is really a fountainhead of the whole environmental movement, as that would be called from, say, the 1970s, is because he was a writer. And above all, the writer of an altogether seminal book, a Sand County Almanac, a writer and a storyteller as well. And as such, he's the kind of scientist who went beyond the language of objectifying science. He talks about in his land ethic, which is really, from our standpoint, an environmental ethic, about things like love, and that wonderful citation that you gave. We can be ethical only in relation to that which we know and love. And his land ethic includes words like beauty in it and so forth. Scientists of his day wouldn't ordinarily be caught using such language. But if I could briefly, because I know others have lots to say here, just say something about that really core chapter in the Sand County Almanac called Thinking Like a Mountain, that justly the most famous. And why is it famous? Partly because it's a story. It's a story that he tells, and it's a story in some ways that he tells against himself. This is a conversion narrative, and I think those of us who are, members of the Green Tribe, we want to get people to think the way sometimes we think they ought to think and so forth. But Leopold goes back and tells about how he got so much wrong as a young man when he was out in Arizona and New Mexico with the Forest Service. And he's out with a bunch of guys, wouldn't you know it, guys with guns. And guys with guns want to shoot things. So there he is, and he thinks he sees a deer, and instead it's a half dozen wolves. And so he does what young men with guns do. He shoots, he shoots, and but a turning point in his understanding, and arguably even a turning point in the whole environmental sense of things. He says he sees something in the eyes of the dying wolf that he'd been part of shooting. He says, my conviction dates from that time. I was naive. I didn't know what I was doing. And I thought that killing wolves would be a good idea because, wolves are a nuisance, aren't they? But that isn't the way a mountain thinks, he says, because the wolves, the predators, have a role in preserving the green growing things on that mountain. So he concludes that that wonderful story that is the basis of his own, Pope Francis speaks of the need for an ecological conversion, and Leopold tells a story of a conversion, namely his own, and he puts himself at the center of that story, and that's why I think his testimony is so significant. He ends that. I love it. I do have to read just a little bit of the end of this because I think it's so telling, where he says, we all strive for what we think is safety, prosperity, comfort, long life, and he adds dullness. We think we want to just sort of get things neatened up and solved and so forth. We strive for what amounts to, he says, peace in our time, which, many of you recognize that comes from the Book of Common Prayer. It also, because he wrote this section during World War II, and fresh in memory of people was Neville Chamberlain, who came back from meeting Adolf Hitler in Munich and pronounced that maybe we'd found peace in our time, which was not peace. So when is a peace not peace? And so he can, for Leopold, we should seek not necessarily a superficial peace, but the wider view, that global citizenship that you're talking about. And last, I'll just finish with this. The other quotation, as you already noted, where he talks about Thoreau's dictum in wildness as the salvation of the world. Except I don't know whether deliberately he misquotes Thoreau, and instead of saying in wildness is the preservation, he says in wildness is the salvation of. He ups the ante. He gets that, in effect, that spiritual holistic dimension into that, and that's sort of that's sort of the culmination of that whole wonderful chapter, Thinking Like a Mountain. And it's by telling that story, I think, that Leopold so much reshaped people's understanding of their relation to the natural world. Let me stop there. Other people have lots to say, I think.
Rand, do you care to, do you have something you want to respond to John there, or
I would not want to, that is perfect. Let's leave that discussion where it ended. It's wonderful.
oh, Jerry, would you could you help us with some of the things in the chat and bring some of those questions up?
Yeah, I can. I've been writing furiously, but I will throw a couple of big ones out, Rand. So you need to solve the problem, and John, the existential problem of humanity here in these questions. So be ready for this. So all this seems to beg the question, Joey says, what is our place in God's good creation? Leopold seems to know his place. And in knowing his place, he became who God created him to be. What do you think of that?
Right. And I think that maybe is something we don't really want to hear. It's like the people who wanted the 10 commandments of the land ethic, but that is our responsibility.
Yeah, and truthfully, my comment to that also, John, I don't know where you were, I didn't want to step on you, is also, I see the same impulse in Christian care ministry and churches. We want to rush to solutions, right? We want to solve, and influence, and lobby. I see Leopold, I see in Joey's comment that Leopold first knew who he was.
Mm-hmm.
And that matters. And I wonder what the church's role is in telling us who we are. And how important is that for creation care ministry? Telling people who they are. Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a great question, because there's that wonderful saying that if you don't know who you are, the world's going to tell you, and they may be doing you a favor. The point is, having spent 30 years in higher education, I was stunned how uncentered and ungrounded most of my students were. Now, I was in public education, higher education, but I was stunned at how little people really knew themselves. So I spoke to my brother, who spent his career in Christian higher education, and said, do you think I'm being really judgmental here or something? And he said, no, I really feel the same way. That the students I was getting, even in a small Christian school, came in really not knowing who they were, and they were not grounded, even if they had been churched. And so I think it goes to the heart of a really huge issue. And I appreciate Reverend Joy and Brother Joy bringing that up, because it's a journey that we're on, and it in a superficial society with so many diversions and so many devices that take us away from ourselves. I think there's a role in our programming to really address that growth, and maybe it means going through those stages of faith and having those conversations. I don't know. I've only done a few groups in my church with regard to confirmation classes and whatever. So I can't speak more broadly to that, but I think it raises a very important issue. This is fundamental to who we are as individuals. It's fundamental to our faith, and it's fundamental to how creation care works out in the world.
I might just add to that. I think that, for Leopold, discovering who he was had a lot to do with where he was. And, as he writes in Sand County Almanac, this is in a way, reminds me of Wendell Berry's remarks about a marginal farm. This is marginal land. It was, and yet he hunkered down in this shack. And you know, much of the almanac is something very homely and ordinary, just looking around and seeing what happens month to month, and simply absorbing and making a place for himself. And so I think, so far as our own understanding of, you know, sometimes I think we have very, you know, grandiose notions of what, you know, environmental preservation of the spectacular sites and so forth. But for Leopold, I mean, it was really it was really fun making himself at home and finding a home, and describing lots of things he describes there are just the you know, the familiar commonplace mammals and plants that many of us would find around us as well. So I think that's at least a dimension.
And that's a very important point, because I think that we find this in our own backyards. And we don't have to be out on a 500-acre farm or out in a wilderness area. That this reconnection happens everywhere we are, and it has to. I remember in our living in an icon, I remember Jerry saying once that we need to name things because that's very powerful. And I remember that Aldo Leopold named things. He noticed them deeply. He understood relationships, and his family, they would do mist netting of birds. They would capture the birds every year and put a band on them and then release them and recapture them. They could write the life histories of these birds they knew as individuals throughout the time they were at the shack. And that's deep noticing, and that's having that deep connection to where you are. And it's composting, it's gardening, it's where you are. It doesn't have to be somewhere else. I see Pat's hand up.
So yeah, I don't know if the rest of us can say things, but this conversation reminds me of the biblical story of the Garden of Eden, in which God created Adam out of the dust of the earth. And so the mere fact that we exist as human beings puts us in relationship with the earth, simply because we were created out of it. And so maybe Leopold recognized that in the eyes of the wolf, but I recognize that in this biblical understanding that I was created out of the dust of the earth. And science can tell us now that the molecules in the earth, the soil of the earth, are the same molecules that are in our body. So I really don't take a whole lot of the Bible literally, but that's one piece I can take literally, is that we are the earth and the earth is us. And so maybe to discover who we are necessitates us discovering that we are a part of the earth. And if we don't know that, then we don't know who we are.
Yeah, and that's a real challenge. You know, there's a great book by James Louvre of the nature deficit disorder, The Last Child in the Woods, and it concerns me, having been in higher education, of how we get these experiences. And I would like to think that through our church camps and other things that we can create those experiences too. Is finding out who you are in relation to those other creatures out there. We know that it builds empathy, and one of the things that I find just remarkable is our lack of empathy in our modern culture. And I wonder if that's been pushed to the wayside because we're really not spending enough time in nature as young people.
I think almost certainly. Kathy Johnson has pointed out in chat, I think that this may be a statement that ties all this together, a moment in Leopold's life. Leopold knew who he was after he looked into the wolf's dying eyes, which is just a moment that kind of captures, I think, the things you guys have been saying. And maybe, Rand, what you're just saying, that nature deficit, we don't have enough of us and our children looking in the dying eyes of others.
Mm-hmm.
If we were to do that, we would be different.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. So the other one is Jim Cook. While the work of creation care goes on among the major thinkers from Leopold to today, there's a great gap between them and so many of us, or many of those who hold the political and special interest power to determine the future of the planet. I'm going to interpret that also to mean when they say political and special interest power, it probably largely refers to economic power. Anyway, those who hold this political and special interest power to determine the future of the planet, this fragile earth or island home, asks the question, what hope might there be for the generations who come after us? Is that a big enough question for you?
That's a big one.
I mean, if I'll push it myself. If creation care ministry has to deal in something, right? What's our vocation? And is our vocation actually hope? And if it is hope, we have to answer this question. What hope is there for the generations to come after us? Does Leopold have any insight for that?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm trying to pull up any passage from his writings, and I can't right now, but I can say that the way he lived his life was a life of hope. The way he went to individuals and farmers and tried to work with them on trying to seek ways to rejuvenate or to work with their land and improve it. That was an act of hope. And if you look at his life too, with the tremendous pushback he got from his colleagues, he sent all of his papers out to his colleagues to read before he would try to publish them. And they were brutally critical of a great many of his ideas. And he would set it aside for 10 years and let it steep a little bit, and he would come back at it in another way. He wrote a great essay on why we should care about creation and the environment that was never published. He came down to two reasons why we should take care of the earth. The first is that oh, now I'm trying to remember the exact words, and I don't know that I can. He was heavily influenced in 1931 by a conference they had in Canada called the Montagnard Conference, where all these scientists came together and they tried to understand why you have these population booms and crashes in animals. And they discovered that the one denominator really was sunspots. You've got the sunspot activity, and that creates the booms and crashes in populations of animals. At the same time, he was reading Ouspensky, who was a great Russian mystic and philosopher. And he came up with the idea that the earth is a living being. Now we know that today through James Lovelock, right? Who had the Gaia hypothesis. James Lovelock was a scientist that in the 1970s, am I correct on that? He came up with the Gaia hypothesis that the earth is a living being. Well, the pushback was enormous from scientists or whatever. So the point is, Aldo didn't publish his ideas either because he got so much pushback from his critique, from his colleagues, that he decided not to touch that one. So then he came back at a different way. He said, that's probably too obtuse for most of you scientists. So let me put it in another way. Maybe God's been around a lot longer than you. Perhaps God just loves to see flowers bloom and hear birds sing. What about that one? Is that a rationale that should justify our activities or not? Now he was an interesting person. He didn't have any really strong religious affiliations. He was not churched as a young man, but he read the Bible voraciously, starting when he was at Yale in the School of Forestry. And if you read his works, I know John knows this, and several of you, you see these beautiful phrases from the Old Testament coming up when the morning stars sang together or whatever. They permeate his writing. So he was very much, at least as literature, he was very much into that. But the point is that I think that his colleagues were so upset with some of his sort of mystical views on some of these matters that he didn't publish a lot of really interesting writing. I don't know if that answered any questions or just muddled the water, but.
If I could add to that,
we're up against. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
I would certainly second Rand's reflection that the kind of hope that Leopold sustained was like our own Christian hope, one that had to confront the cross. And there's that famous, remark of his that to be a conservationist is to be aware that we live in a world of wounds, and he was aware of those wounds. And among the other tough stuff, I can identify he had tough time getting his great book published, getting it rejected for a lot of the time, and never appeared in his lifetime. So certainly he was up against a few things, but I think part of the larger hope is that of the vision, and what he describes in the land ethic chapter is a kind of evolutionary progress in humankind's sense of ethical awareness. Originally, to be ethical is just to be kind to the people in your clan. Then, it spreads that, well, maybe we should be kind to people in our own country, however you define country. But then the very idea that we are all neighbors to humans across the globe is a later stage. And then he thinks that he's on the cusp of recognizing, as did Aldo Schweitzer, that ethics pertains to our relation to non-humans as well in a very fundamental sense. So he had an optimism, at least at what the vision was presenting, however far short we fall of fulfilling what that vision means, and so that sense that to be ethical means that we have recognized the non-human dimensions of creation, as well as falling under what the parable of the Good Samaritan is suggesting to us. So I think, at least implicitly, he certainly recognizes that. His statement right at the beginning, to me, sums it up. It says that we need to think of land not as a commodity belonging to us, but community to which we belong. And as Christians, that's a very broad community, including even the communion of saints, as a result. So I think his was a well-tempered hope, but one that he sustained through great adversity, as Rand has described.
We're drawing close to the end of our time here, but I'd like to just throw one last observation or question out, perhaps to both of you. There was a book written back in the late 80s, I guess, called Baptized into Wilderness. It was written by Richard Cartwright Austin, who is a Presbyterian theologian, minister, at that point, the southernmost producer of maple syrup in the country, lived in Virginia. And he wrote this book, which is his introduction to environmental theology, in which he interpreted John Muir as a semi-heretical Christian prophet. Because Muir had these experiences of God and nature, but his very strict Calvinistic upbringing did not allow him to understand that as being God and nature. So he rejected Christianity as he knew it, but continued to write and speak in those terms, sometimes sacramentally, the blood of the sequoia and all this sort of stuff. So it strikes me that both these men, although not necessarily churched in the traditional way we think of it, nevertheless came out of that ethos and then gave us the beginnings of the environmental movement in general, as well, of course, in this country. Any thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Rand.
No, that was a profound thought. Again, I would rather leave it the way it is. But John Muir was an interesting person. He was a spiritualist and very mystical, not necessarily very religious. But I just, this is an aside really, but I can't resist saying it. one of the travesties and tragedies of American conservation is what John Muir did in the creation of Yosemite, which was violence against Native Americans and a variety of other people. In other words, clear that out. There was this argument, and it still goes on today. I've worked in Africa for 30 years, and this is still going on. Preservation versus conservation. Preservation is don't let anybody touch it. Maybe a few scientists can come in, but don't let the local people use it. Conservation is wise use and facilitating and building alliances to actually use a resource. But I think that in that sense, John Muir was a preservationist and not necessarily one that most of us would find meets the modern sensibilities.
Yeah.
Could I just add, I think Muir was talking about God a whole lot in his writing, you know, so he was a member of this peculiar Campbellite sect in his background, but he's steeped in the Bible. He memorized most of it, and his writing is full of those things. And, you know, and I particularly like his remark where he says, you know, the Spirit of God is written across all of God's works, but in capital letters in Yosemite, you know,
That's true. That's true.
Sums up a lot of his sense of things. I think Cindy had her hand up to say something.
I'm not sure if this is off topic, but what just keeps occurring to me, you were talking about John Muir and Aldo Leopold still bringing that ethos, if you like, of the Christian tradition with them. But so much of what we've just been talking about is our discovery articulated by those two men, Leopold, of the fact that we're totally embedded in nature, we're part of nature, we're connected. And what occurs to me is that learning culturally, moving out of that Christian ethos, it's also it's a discovery of learning out of a colonial mentality. You know, these, you know, they're huge. And then, you know, Rand, you brought up Muir's sort of destruction of Native American communities in his conservation or preservationist. And so we're just learning things that other groups and cultures have known for thousands of years. So anyway, I'm just noticing that isn't this wonderful that we are now, you know, thanks to Aldo Leopold and so on. And of course, we do have to learn out of, like, grow out of our ways we've been inculcated. But yeah, it's a bit funny after a while that isn't this wonderful that we're finally discovering these things that others have known, and as colonists with a colonial mentality. I mean, yes, there's a Christian background to it, which we want to retrieve, but we also have to disentangle a kind of colonial mentality that was built into that Christian ethos.
No, exactly. That's a wonderful point. And in the Iona community, I was the moderator for the Common Concern Network, the environment, for 5 years. And we've been struggling with dominionism and struggling with decolonizing the language. And if you work globally and internationally with Christians or others, you realize the extreme bitterness of our view of stewardship or dominion. And so it was really something you have to work around and think through. Because it has not played out well in other cultures. There's a great book called Conservation Refugees, which is about the conservation movement and how it has impacted local people in this country, but especially globally, and with the quashing of dissent and with violence if necessary in order to impose this view of the world, a colonial view of the world. So in a lot of my writings, I say that really the last vestige of colonialism is climate change. And that is still colonizing the majority world, and certainly the South, is that the repercussions of our behavior, our consumer behavior, and whatever else is having devastating consequences locally. And we have to deal with that because local people and local Christians and local Methodists, when you're out there working internationally, ask these questions. well, now, wait a minute, you weren't very good stewards. And to me, we just need to own that and say, you're right. And we need to go through the process of contrition, confession, forgiveness, atonement, redemption. We need to go through that process because without it, we are seen as those people who still inflicted a great deal of damage through extractive industries and whatever else. So it's a really critical issue in global Christianity and the global South. Thank you for mentioning that and bringing up some of those points, Cynthia.
Well, we've had a wonderful, rich discussion tonight.
Oh, Robin, let's finish.
I think we've all learned something.
know.
Jerry, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I just want to call out Elizabeth's mention of a book, Come Have Breakfast by Elizabeth Johnson. So notice that in the chat. And then I don't know how to solve Jane's woodchuck problem. It actually would be a worthy conversation all by itself to say, how does the land ethic apply to Jane's woodchuck problem? It
Yes.
actually would be not a bad spiritual exercise.
No.
So,
Oh, Rand, would it be possible for you to put your email in the chat for those that want to contact you about your PowerPoint?
Yes, I can do that. Maybe.
See if you can.
There it is. Wait.
All right.
actually, I don't see it. If you put it in,
I'm working on it.
okay.
I'm slow.
And this video, of course, is recorded and will be available on YouTube for the Center for Deepening Faith. So all things
And-
mentioned here. The other thing you can do about chat is to save it for yourselves. So just to call that out. So in your upper right-hand corner, there's 3 dots. You click on those 3 dots, and one of the options is save chat. And it'll go somewhere on your computer. Can't solve that one for you.
Can I make one
Yes, sir.
final comment then? Just very briefly, if you go to Aldo Leopold Foundation, there's a lot of resources there. They'll give you access to it. They've got great videos. One was a PBS special on Aldo Leopold. They've got learning guides. The book is at a special price during the 75th anniversary of $7.50, which is a pretty decent price for a book these days. For Sand County Almanac, but there's a lot of resources there for young people, and they do a lot of things globally and internationally. So anyway, access that Aldo Leopold Foundation if you have any other sorts of questions or interests.
Well, I think with that, you have hopefully there you have Rand's email and you have the Sister Elizabeth's citation there of the book. So give you a moment and then I will close the meeting. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, for being part of our discussion, and looking forward to hopefully our getting together in October to hear Cindy help us out with evolution and salvation. Looking forward to that too. Thank you. Have a blessed
Upon all
evening.
in harm's way with the hurricane, including all the
Yes.
animals.
And
Yeah.
stay
that
safe.
are equally in harm's way.
Amen.
Thank you.
Good night.
Wonderful.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, man.